In the early years of World War II, German paratroopers shocked the world with audacious airborne assaults, but their victories came at a high price. The American answer? Drop a tank in with their own airborne forces. Enter the M22 Locust, a bold attempt to give paratroopers armored support from the skies. Shaped by logistical challenges, battlefield demands, and wartime innovation, the Locust was designed to be small, light, and air mobile. But for all its innovation, it couldn't escape the compromises that doomed it in combat. If you're passionate about armored history like we are, then you'll want to check out Steel Aces, a new free-to-play tank MMO that's taking a fresh approach to the genre. Unlike some other games, Steel Aces is built entirely around fairness. There are no pay-to-win mechanics, and success on the battlefield comes down to skill and tactics, not your wallet. The game lets you explore over a century of armored warfare, from some of the very first tanks all the way to modern main battle tanks. With vehicles from more than 40 countries and a planned roster of over 1,000 armored vehicles, including tanks, tracked and wheeled fighting vehicles, Steel Aces aims to give players access to a huge and historically rich lineup, without resorting to fake or imaginary designs. The focus is on historical authenticity and balanced gameplay, no asymmetrical mechanics like artillery or aircraft, no pay-to-win premium ammunition or overpowered premium tanks, and no loot boxes. The game will feature multiple game modes, from arcade battles with hit points to realistic and simulator modes with story-driven missions, so there's something for everyone. The team behind Steel Aces is small and independent, free from profit-driven publishers and able to make the right choices to build a great game. And on a personal note, we've been following the development from the very beginning, and had fun in some of the earliest tests. The game is evolving at a rapid pace, so don't miss out on giving your vital feedback to the devs, and they do actually listen to it. If you're interested in a grounded, historically rich tank MMO focused purely on tactical ground combat, then Steel Aces is well worth a look. It's free to play, and there's even a Kickstarter campaign supporting its development. You'll find all the details linked in the description below. At the start of the war, German Fallschirmjägers achieved dramatic success in spearheading operations across the Low Countries, Norway, and Greece. Yet, their victories came at a steep cost, revealing the inherent vulnerability of lightly armed airborne troops. To address this, the United States began exploring ways to provide paratroopers with armored support. Around the same time, in early 1941, Britain also sought a tank suitable for airborne deployment. Lacking the industrial capacity to develop one themselves, the British Air Commission in Washington approached the U.S. Ordnance Department for assistance. On February 27, 1941, discussions began involving the Armored Force, the U.S. Army Air Forces, and the Ordnance Department to define the requirements for an air-transportable tank, and the aircraft that would carry it. One of the first designers approached was John Walter Christie, the prolific interwar innovator best known for his namesake suspension system. Christie presented his design in fall 1941, but this tank clearly did not meet the specifications to even a casual observer. So he presented another tank in November 1941, which again didn't meet the specifications. In July 1941, the Marmon Harrington Company submitted its design for an air-deployable light tank, designated Light Tank T9. On August 31st, a wooden mock-up was inspected by both the Air Corps and the Douglas Aircraft Company, likely to assess whether it could be slung beneath the C-54 Skymaster transport plane. Around the same time, the Pontiac division of General Motors also proposed their own design. However, the contract ultimately went to Marmon Harrington, whose proposal was less expensive. Initial assessments must have been encouraging, as in November 1941, Marmon Harrington delivered a wooden model of the upper hull structure for further compatibility checks with the C-54 Skymaster. When tested without its turret, the design required only minor adjustments to be underslung beneath the aircraft. This apparent promise led the U.S. Army to express interest in acquiring 500 T-9 light tanks around the beginning of 1942. However, this plan was quickly overtaken by further developments. By February 1942, work had already begun on upgrading the tank to new standard designated T-9E1. A soft steel prototype featuring powered turret traverse and a gyro-stabilized gun mount was tested with the C-54 at Fort Benning by May 1942, then further evaluated at Fort Bragg and the GM Proving Grounds. These tests led to significant design changes that increased the tank's weight and reduced performance. Concerned, representatives from Marmon Harrington, the Armored Force, and the Ordnance Department convened on May 31, 1942. Both the US Army Air Forces and British emphasized that the weight must not exceed 15,800 pounds, or about 7166 kilograms. As a result, several features were cut: the fixed hull machine guns, the gyro stabilizer, and the power turret traverse. Gear ratios also had to be revised. This lighter pilot of the T-9E1 was subsequently sent for further testing at both Marmon-Harrington and the GM Proving Grounds, and by November 1942 it was ready for flight tests in California. These revealed only minor issues, and the prototype was returned to Marmon-Harrington in January 1943 for final refinements. These were incorporated into the T-9E1, which now featured stronger protection from the front and improved visibility for the driver. A newly designed turret was also introduced, now featuring separate hatches for the commander and gunner, along with 2 periscopes. In April 1942, a wooden mock-up of the updated T-9E1 was shipped to Fort Benning for further compatibility testing with the Skymaster. Following this, authorization was granted to build 2 pilot models of the tank. The first was completed in November 1942 and sent to Aberdeen Proving Ground in Maryland for initial evaluation. After completing tests there, it was transferred to the Armored Force in February 1943. The second T-9E1 was sent overseas to Britain, accompanied by a U.S. Ordnance officer associated with the program. Before the T-9E1 was even standardized, the U.S. Army authorized an ambitious production run of 1,900 tanks. Initial hopes were that deliveries could begin by November 1942, but delays pushed the start of production by Marmon-Harrington to April 1943. That same month, however, the order was reduced to 960 tanks. By September 1943, a preliminary report from the Armored Board cast a shadow over the T-9E1's future. The report concluded the tank was neither durable nor reliable and could not be used successfully for landings. Criticism was really aimed at the powertrain, especially the transmission and road wheels, which were easily misaligned and deformed during testing. As a result, on January 25, 1944, the U.S. Army revised the order once more. Production ceased entirely by February 1944, with only 830 vehicles built. In September or October 1944, the T-9E1 was designated Light Tank M22 and classified as a limited standard, meaning equipment that met some requirements for military service but would not ordinarily be issued to combat units. The British gave the M22 light tank its Locust name, likely envisioning a swarm of these light tanks descending upon enemy positions like a biblical plague. The front of the M22 light tank featured a sharply sloped glacis plate and a rounded housing for the transmission system. Above the transmission was a removable access panel, likely intended for maintenance purposes. The front plate also carried 2 headlights, one on each side, a siren, and the driver's hatch located on the left. Each side of the hull was sloped and fitted with lifting lugs and pioneering tools, and the right side also had an exhaust. The rear featured exhaust pipes, towing eyes, and another access hatch. The engine deck had 2 more access hatches and a vent. On the underside of the hull, an escape hatch was located on the front right section. The turret was relatively compact, with the main gun mount and lifting eye positioned at the front. The turret roof was fitted with 3 periscopes, a ventilator, dual hatches, and an antenna mount in the rear. The M22 light tank had an unloaded weight of 14,600 pounds, or about 6.6 metric tons, and a combat weight of 16,400 pounds, 7.4 metric tons. The tank was 155 inches or 4 meters long, 88.5 inches or 2.25 meters wide, and 72.5 inches or 1.84 meters tall, with a ground clearance of 10 inches or 25.4 centimeters. The M22 light tank's armor was a compromise between protection and weight, a trade-off necessary for its role as an air transportable vehicle. However, this armor was not thick enough to protect the tank against anti-tank guns, even those of smaller calibers. The whole armor was rolled homogeneous steel and the turret was cast homogeneous steel, assembled using welding. The front armor was just 1 inch, or 25.5 millimeters thick over the transmission and driver's compartment, with the upper front plate only half an inch. The side armor along the hull was also measured around half an inch, and the hull roof was even thinner, at just over 1/3 of an inch. The turret armor was light too, just an inch thick around the sides, while the roof varied between 0.375 and 0.75 inches, offering little protection from plunging fire and overhead threats. The M22 light tank had a crew of 3. The driver was seated in the left front of the hull. In the turret, the gunner sat to the left of the main gun and was responsible for aiming and firing it, while the commander sat to the right of the gun and also served as the loader. The M22 light tank was powered by a 162 horsepower Lycoming 0435T 6-cylinder air-cooled gas engine, paired with a manual fixed-ratio gearbox offering 4 forward gears and 1 reverse. It ran on 80-octane fuel with a 57-gallon or 215-liter capacity, giving it a range of up to 110 miles. Its maximum road speed was 35 miles per hour, or about 56 kilometers per hour. The vehicle sat on vertical volute spring suspension and utilized T78 tracks designed by Cardin Lloyd, featuring dry pins and constructed from malleable iron. Each track was 11 inches or 28 centimeters wide and 30 inches or 76.2 centimeters long. The M22 light tank was equipped with a 37mm M6 gun and an M53 mount, alongside a coaxial 30 caliber M1919A4 machine gun. By the time it entered service, the 37mm gun was already outdated, unable to penetrate the armor of most German tanks. The turret could traverse a full 360 degrees, with the main gun elevating between -10 and +30 degrees, capable of firing up to 30 rounds per minute. It could use armor-piercing capped M51, armor-piercing M74, high-explosive M63, and canister M2 ammunition. The tank carried 50 rounds for the main gun and 2,500 rounds for the machine gun. Additionally, the crew were issued 3 M3 grease guns chambered in 45 ACP with 450 rounds of submachine gun ammunition. Initially, the M22 light tank was designed to be airlifted under a C-54 Skymaster using 4 lifting lugs and hoist cables, with the turret removed and stowed inside the aircraft. After landing, the tank would be unloaded in roughly 10 minutes and then reassembled, likely requiring lifting equipment to remount the turret. This exposed the crew and slowed down operations, all while relying on the capture of an intact, serviceable airstrip. Later aircraft, like the Fairchild C-82 Packet, which entered service in June 1945, could carry a fully assembled M22, partially resolving the issue. But by then, the tank's fundamental flaws had already been exposed. Using the Leister-Kaufmann CG-10 glider was also considered, but the M22 proved to be too heavy for that. In the end, the Americans were unable to find a solution for air deploying these tanks. Several experimental variants were developed using the M22 chassis. One was the light tractor T-18, an artillery tractor version of the original T-9 chassis with an open body for ammunition, though was ultimately not accepted for service. Another was the light tank T-9E2, which mounted an 81mm mortar in a modified turret. The gun itself was completed, but the pilot vehicle was never finished before the war ended. Canada also explored a variant known as the load carrier tractor, full track laying, a vehicle designed to carry just about all light supplies up to troops or tow artillery. It appears the idea faded over time. There were also unconfirmed proposals for flamethrower tanks, ambulances, command vehicles, and even anti-aircraft variants based on the M22. Unfortunately, little documentation survives regarding these ideas. On August 6, 1943, General Order 77 from Headquarters Armored Command officially activated the 151st Airborne Tank Company, the first American tank unit specifically created for airborne operations. Just 9 days later, on August 15th, 5 officers and 70 enlisted men arrived at Fort Knox to form the unit. Their task was to train with the T-9E1, the prototype of what would become the M22. This made them not only the first U.S. unit to operate airborne tanks, but also the first to experiment with glider-delivered armor. Throughout the next year, the 151st underwent extensive training. By August 1944, the unit had earned its glider qualification, though the long preparation time likely impacted the M22's eventual role in combat. In mid-1944, a joint staff made up of officers from the 22nd Corps, the Airborne Center, and the 1st Troop Carrier Command began planning a large-scale exercise combining airborne and ground forces. The resulting maneuver, held near Camp McCall in North Carolina between August 6th and 24th, became the largest night operation and final division-level airborne exercise of the war conducted at the camp. Roughly 2,000 paratroopers and 10,000 additional soldiers took part. However, the M22 tanks could not be deployed by air, so the 151st had to represent a fictional German Panzerjäger battalion instead. Despite this limitation, the unit's performance during the maneuvers was considered satisfactory. Later that October, the 151st traveled to Washington, D.C. for an airborne demonstration. They continued with physical fitness exams and tank gunnery training through December 1944, with most of the crews achieving first-class gunner ratings. Yet despite their high level of preparation, the lack of reliable delivery system for the M22, and the growing demand for trained personnel elsewhere led Airborne Command to conclude the unit was no longer viable. On December 31, 1944, the 151st Airborne Tank Company was officially disbanded, and its members were reassigned throughout the Army. The other unit to use the M22 was the 28th Airborne Tank Battalion. It was activated on December 6, 1943 by General Order 2 and was larger than the 151st to allow for more operational tanks. However, due to a lack of suitable tank delivery system, the 28th was ultimately converted into a conventional medium tank battalion. Around 25 M22 were sent to Europe in April 1944 with the 6th Army Group for the 1st Airborne Division in Alsace. Nothing is known about what happened to these tanks, but they did not return to the US. It's likely they were never deployed in battle, as the Airborne Center had by that time concluded they were not needed. After the war, many M22 Locusts were sold off as surplus, some even into private hands. In a striking example, Life magazine reported in late 1945 or early 1946 on Camille Dupre, a landowner in Illinois who purchased 2 M22s from Rock Island Arsenal for $100 each. He used one for spare parts and converted the other into a makeshift tractor on his 310-acre marshland property. Even though the vehicle proved unreliable, Camille continued to use it, referring to it as simply the thing. Around 1941, the British Airborne Tank in service was the Light Tank Mark VII Tetrarch, on which we also have a video article you should check out too. However, the Tetrarch was never truly designed for airborne use, it was simply adapted into the role. With the United States ramping up Lend-Lease production, Britain hoped that a purpose-built airborne tank would soon arrive from across the Atlantic, especially given that they've already developed a reliable way to deliver such vehicles by air. Their solution was the large General Aircraft Limited GAL-49 Hamilcar, commonly known as the Hamilcar Glider. In July 1943, the second T-9E1 pilot tank, originally sent to Britain, was loaded into a Hamilcar to confirm its suitability for airborne deployment. The trial was a success. Although further testing exposed some operational issues, the tank was still declared combat capable. By October 1943, the 6th Airborne Armored Reconnaissance Regiment received the first batch of 17 M22 light tanks. In total, Britain would receive approximately 260 through Lend-Lease, roughly 28% of total production. To address the underwhelming performance of the 37mm, the British adapted a version of the Littlejohn adapter for the M22. This device squeezed armor-piercing rounds as they exited the barrel, significantly boosting their velocity and penetration. However, it came with a trade-off. The tank could no longer fire high-explosive shells. Other modifications included British smoke launchers and likely a new radio. For Operation Overlord, the codename for the Allied landings in Normandy, Britain planned to deploy airborne troops using their heavy gliders. By March 1944, the British had allocated 29 Hamilcars and 32 M22 light tanks for upcoming operations, with 26 slated for combat use and 6 in reserve. However, during the actual landings, none would be deployed until the end of the Normandy campaign. Some tanks would finally see combat during Operation Varsity, the massive airborne assault launched to support the Allied crossing of the Rhine River. On March 7, 1945, Allied forces had captured the Ludendorff Bridge, a critical crossing point over the river. Although the bridge collapsed 10 days later, it had already enabled thousands of troops to cross into Germany. With the bridge gone, the 28th Airborne Corps, consisting of the British 6th Airborne Division and the US 17th Airborne Division, was tasked with seizing the high ground north of Bergen via an airborne assault. As part of this operation, the 6th Airborne Division deployed 8 M22 light tanks using Hamilcar gliders. These were organized into 2 troops of 3 tanks each, along with a headquarters troop of 2 tanks, and crewed by 3 officers and 24 enlisted men. On March 24, 1945, the gliders were launched, but things quickly went wrong. One glider failed mid-air before even reaching the landing zone. The situation worsened when German anti-aircraft guns opened fire and smoke obscured the designated landing areas. Of the 7 M22 carrying gliders that reached the landing zone during Operation Varsity, only 4 landed successfully while the other 3 crashed. One slammed into a house, damaging the tank's main gun. Despite this, the crew managed to support the 513th Parachute Infantry Regiment using only the coaxial machine gun. Another glider landed nose first in a ditch, violently ejecting the tank, which flipped upside down and was rendered inoperable. A third lost a wing mid-air, crashing and flipping the tank, but remarkably the crew survived and regrouped with their commander, whose glider had landed successfully despite having damaged wheels. Even among the successful landings, mechanical issues plagued the tanks. One M22 broke down while towing a jeep and was repurposed as a static fortification. Another glider landed so hard that its rear door jammed shut, forcing the M22 to smash through it. Unfortunately, the tank was later hit by what was believed to be a shell from a Jagdpanther, or more likely a Stug 3 of Sturmgeschütz Brigade 394, so you can imagine how that turned out with 1 inch of armor. Of the 4 Locusts that reached the rendezvous point, only 2 were fully operational. These were deployed to high ground east of the Diesvoorde while being covered by the 2 damaged tanks. Upon arrival, they were engaged by German troops and had to be supported by an infantry company, and soon their presence began attracting a great deal of artillery and anti-tank fire. Though the tanks weren't hit, several infantrymen were, forcing withdrawal after a few hours. The combined force then held off several German attacks until finally being relieved by Allied troops. After the war, the tank continued to see limited use. In the Netherlands, 2 M22 light tanks ended up in a Canadian vehicle dump, which was purchased by the Dutch in May 1946. These tanks were reassigned for training purposes before being retired and scrapped sometime after 1951. Belgium also acquired a number of surplus M22s through scrap dealers in 1946, and at least some of them were transported to the Congo, where they were ultimately abandoned when Belgian forces left the colony. Egypt received a small batch of M22s from Britain and used them during the 1948 Arab-Israeli War. Some were destroyed in combat, others were captured by Israeli forces, who operated them until 1953. At least one of these captured tanks survives to this day. The M22 light tank was born out of innovation and necessity, a bold attempt to bring armored support to the skies. But despite the ambition behind its design, it was hampered by underwhelming performance, logistical hurdles, and the brutal realities of airborne warfare. Its rocky debut during Operation Varsity only confirmed what many had already suspected. The Locust was an interesting idea that didn't quite land. That wraps up our look at the M22 Locust light tank. What do you think? Was it an overlooked asset that never got a fair shot, or a doomed concept that should have stayed on the drawing board? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. If you haven't done so already, we invite you to subscribe to stay updated on future content. If you'd like to contribute further, consider Patreon or PayPal. Speaking of which, we want to especially thank our medium and heavy tank Patreon supporters: Barrett Gunther, Dan Fitzpatrick, Dave Schuford, Leslie Holkower, Michael Herman, Owen M., R. Rob, and Sopwith21. Your generous contributions help fund our research, illustrations, and video production. Until next time, keep us in your